Today is Thursday, July 1st, 2021. My name is Vivian Zhang, an intern at the Houston Asian American Archive, and today I have the privilege of interviewing Mr. Andy Chan, who is the current mayor of the city of Southside Place. So, Mr. Chan, could you just briefly introduce yourself, kind of when and where you were born?
Yes, so my full name is actually Andrew Chan, but everyone calls me Andy. I was born in New York City, specifically the borough of Queens. I was born August 11th, 1965.
And what was it like growing up in New York?
Uh, I was pretty young. I do remember that we were in a multi-story apartment right across from Flushing Meadow Park. In fact, if I looked out my window, I could actually see the rockets that were left over from the World's Fair that were there. Um, there was a mixed culture there. There was quite a few Jewish families and Asian families that were living there. And I actually remember back, which really dates me, but my pediatrician actually lived down the street and would actually do house calls and carry the traditional leather doctor's bag and walked in and did the exam and so forth. And um, yeah, neighbors would just watch after me when my parents were busy. So.
Could you talk a little bit about like your family, like your parents, when they came to the US and stuff like that?
So my parents came to the U.S. specifically for college opportunities. Both were born in Hong Kong. My father did actually live for a period of time in the southern Canton region of actual China and go back and forth, but predominantly lived in Hong Kong. My mom was at Hong Kong. Um, Pretty typical story where my grandparents wanted them to have a better opportunity. Uh, Went to pretty much traditional Catholic schools while over there and then came to the United States. My father originally went to Minnesota, of all places. Had no idea how cold it was or anything. Um, and he tells the story of how he didn't speak great English. And when he first came, he knew what Campbell soup was and ate a lot of that in his dorm on a little burner. And then he gathered enough money and went to a diner to order food, and all he recognized was soup and wound up ordering another bowl of soup instead of having a hamburger, which is what he really wanted. My mom was on the East Coast. I don't remember the university she went to, but eventually both of them wound up in New York City, where they attended. My father was studying graphic arts, and my mother was in biology at the time, and wound up doing biochem. So.
Yeah. So what were your parents like occupations when you were growing up?
So my father was actually one of the art directors for World Dutch Shell Oil Company.
Mhm.
And so when Shell came down to Houston, when they were setting up Shell 1 and Shell 2 to be their US headquarters, he was asked to come down and join them. My mother at the time was studying, uh, she actually worked in the biochem labs doing testing over at St. Joseph Hospitals, and at the same time was raising myself and then my younger sister, who's 6 years younger than me, while also doing a master's degree program in public health for the University of Texas. And so she was juggling quite a bit back then.
Yeah, yeah. So I saw that you moved to Houston when you were like about six in the 1971. Is that correct?
Yeah, mid 5 year olds right before I turned 6 years old. Yeah.
Why did your family decide to move to Houston?
Mainly because of the transfer from Shell Oil Company. It was a better opportunity for my father, and my mother, like I said, originally wanted to be a physician, but decided she did not want to go through any more schooling. Finished out her master's degree in public health, and then um, did not actually use a whole lot. She stayed with St. Joseph's for quite a while. She didn't use her master's degree until much later in life. So.
Mm. And did you move to Southside Place like then, or was that where did you first move to when you came to Houston?
No, so much of the oil boom companies actually back then, we lived pretty far away. Back then, the trend was actually to live outside of the urban area to be a little more rural.
Mhm.
So we lived up at 1960, up at I-45, which is quite a bit away from downtown. But that was the trend, was to live further out, get more land, and just
Yeah.
carpool in. And so that was pretty typical of.
Yeah. Were there like a lot of Asian Americans back then that lived in Houston or?
At my particular high school, no, there were very few. I think, gosh, I think maybe. So this is prior to when uh, the Vietnamese refugees came into Texas and was setting up.
Mhm.
So I think at that time there was only 5 or 6 of us, and then we had a small influx, but it was very transient back then. So people would come to visit family, they would send their kids to school, but as soon as they had other opportunities, they wound up leaving. So
Yeah, I see. What would you say some of the values that your parents emphasized in your upbringing?
so pretty typical of Asian families is, academics, study. um, I was pretty traditional in the sense of play piano. Uh, we were afforded opportunities that my parents didn't have necessarily growing up. And that was their main thing, was to kind of to try to push certain things. I remember very specifically home computers were just something new coming online. I mean, it's very commonplace now in terms of technology, but back then a Pong video game was hundreds upon hundreds of dollars and played all 3 games. And I
Mhm.
remember my father bought that for the family, and it was like a real big deal. And then getting the first colored personal computer, which was like an old they called it a TI 99-4.
Mm.
So it was like a pretty big deal, and wanting us to kind of learn technology. And we did a little programming on it just to kind
Mhm.
of get into that. But ironically, they didn't necessarily embrace technology until much later than them, but definitely wanted us kids to be kind of exposed to that at a much earlier age than probably most kids actually.
Yeah, that's cool. Like still like back in the 70s and like 80s too.
Hmm.
Yeah. How would you say like your Chinese American identity too like affected your childhood, especially growing up in an area that like didn't have as many Asians?
Well, in New York, I was raised with a family friend, so Cantonese was predominantly spoken. So actually, I didn't speak a lot of English when I was growing up. It was just kind of culturally the thing that you had. Everyone, as you know, was either an auntie or an uncle, right, in an
Mhm.
Asian
Yeah,
family.
yeah.
And so she was Auntie Feng Gujie, who, you know, she was you know, she was the one who took care of me. So evidently, my parents told me that I spoke and wrote Chinese when I was younger. And
Mhm.
then I remember coming and then attending kindergarten school, and I actually had a little bit of catch up to do in the beginning, just because, um, we did speak English internally, but being raised around being taken care of by a nanny who mainly spoke Chinese, that's kind of that. So I I can speak Cantonese conversationally.
Mhm.
Um, my grandfather, when he was alive, used to always just kind of make fun of me. There was an old Chinese idiom where he basically said, um, you know, a cow's head doesn't understand what a horse is speaking. Basically, that's how it kind of broke down.
Yeah.
So, I had kind of have very broken Chinese, but well enough to communicate with them, and certainly well enough to order dim sum. So,
Mhm. That's good. That's all you need.
yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever experience any like discrimination or like racism or anything growing up?
I did. It was pretty typical of kids teasing, the ching chong, the slanted eyes,
Yeah.
I thought you would be more yellow, that
Mhm.
type of thing. So yes, there was definitely a lot of that. Um, you know, Also thinking that Asians were uh, not physically as strong as perhaps other people, and perhaps I kind of got pushed on that. Certainly, people would try to take me to task on certain things, in that sense. And it was like, how much kung fu do you really know, and so forth like that. So, back then too, David Carradine at the time had the kung fu show, and so there was that kind of
Yeah.
yeah, like all Asians should know kung fu, right? So,
Mhm.
but I did know a little bit, so because
Yeah.
my uncle who lived up in Canada, we, when I was younger, we would go up and stay with him, and he knew Wing Chun and actually was a master. In fact, when he was in Hong Kong, he actually took, his master was the famous Ip Man, that's being portrayed in movies and so forth. And
Mhm.
so he brought that, and as he would tell his kids and myself as we were learning together, he says, I'm going to teach you enough to get yourself killed. So don't use it, is what he would say. He said, you know, people are going to push you.
Yeah.
Don't use it to do that. You only use what you learn to get out of, situations. So
Mhm. Did you have any like siblings growing up?
I did. I have a younger sister who's actually 6 years younger than I am.
Okay. Would you say you guys were close, or like was it like too big of like an age gap?
We became much closer, I would say, afterwards when she became an adult.
Mhm.
Certainly I had to take care. I had to take care of her when she was younger. We were kind of key latch kids.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that was pretty typical, especially with my mom doing everything she was doing, my father, that it was pretty commonplace back then to, you know, do that. And since I was 6 years older than she
Yeah, that's
was.
true. That's true. So kind of moving on to like the next phase of your life, what college did you attend?
So originally I attended Texas A&M University. I was there for a year and I did environmental design. Um, I will say I did have some struggles, but I mainly came back when my parents had a business. See, what happened back then was Royal Dutch Shell had bought back out their stocks, and so they offered the U.S. workers a golden parachute in a sense. So they were changing the kind of corporate environment, so to speak.
Mhm.
So the culture was definitely changing. So my father took the early retirement package and then parlayed that money into starting to open up his own businesses. And so this kind of
Mhm.
began my parents' kind of entrepreneurial streak. They owned several businesses. First was an interesting one was they opened up the equivalent of a Benihana, but it was an independent restaurant. It's called Fujiyama Gardens. It was up in 1960. It was a teppanyaki hibachi style restaurant.
Interesting.
People thought they were Japanese, but that wasn't the case. It was in partnership with my aunt, whose boyfriend at the time was actually one of the chief chefs at a former Benihana, and they
Mm.
partnered together and opened up a very successful restaurant back then. And then that spawned another business in graphics, which my father, that was his background. So he wanted to open up his own graphics studio.
Mhm.
And then that spawned like four more other businesses after that. So office supplies, printing,
Wow.
and on and on. So
Did you ever join in like I think I saw somewhere that you like helped your father with his like printing business?
yeah. So when I came back from A&M, my father actually his gallbladder kind of they didn't catch in time, so he kind of um, I guess burst is the best way to put it. Had a
Mhm.
little bit of sepsis that was involved, so he was out for a little bit. Um, and at that time, I was helping out and doing some of the general things. We were kind of involved in my parents' business at a young age, so I would busboy at the Japanese restaurant or stocking supplies at the off supply store. So when they opened up the printing business, I helped them out with that, and then I was doing sales at the time because my father couldn't attend some of the things, so I would go in his place, and that's where I'd have to put on a suit and actually go out and talk to the clients, and then I'd rush back and then help at the store. And um, I took a real interest in the actual mechanics of how the printing press worked, and so I started just wanting to learn that aspect. And then a good thing happened. In some ways, that was a good thing because our printer suddenly left, and I wound up having to kind of just jump in and kind of take over that whole aspect of the business with him.
Yeah. And was this also when you transferred to I think Texas Southern University?
Yeah, my parents actually, so they opened up the original stationery stores up north, and then the print shop got transferred down off Leland, which is near Texas Southern.
Mhm.
Um, we were over there. It's kind of the old Chinatown part, but further down
Yeah, yeah.
in downtown. And so, they had a previous location that was on Main Street. we did a little bit of printing there, but the big printing actually wound up happening off that Leland location, uh, where we wound up expanding the printing business and so forth. So,
What was your experiences like at TSU?
TSU it's a traditional African American university.
Yeah.
So it was actually my first exposure to that environment. Up north, in high school, we didn't have very many African Americans. Um, there was a smaller exposure at Texas A&M. Um, but the one thing I found out is it was a very inviting university in the sense that they wanted to make sure everyone felt inclusive in it, and they challenged all the students there. Um, there's always, I think, a misrepresentation about universities that are predominantly African American, which then started my kind of insight into inequalities that were happening, which later plays on into my public education advocacy. So,
What would you say TSU taught you about like diversity and like inclusion and stuff like that?
well, I was probably one of the very few Asians actually on campus. Very few Caucasians besides in the law school that's on campus. I was in the business program over there. The one thing they wanted to try to teach people was to really think about the fact that you're going to be challenged in life, right? And what you do is you take the opportunities that are given to you and you try to make the best of it. So some of the courses I really enjoyed was the entrepreneurial classes, seeing what my parents were doing. I really enjoyed marketing. So I took extra marketing classes, because I kept thinking to myself, I think in the end, I'm going to wind up owning my own businesses is what I wanted to do. I had a professor who actually set me up on back then it was, before it was JP Morgan, Texas Commerce Bank, before the mergers and so forth. Set me up for an internship and had everything lined up, and I went to the interview and they said, oh, well, we really like you. You've got good recommendations. So what's your interest in finance? I looked at the person, I said, I have very little interest in finance. I might have good grades in it, and the professor might want me to do this. I really want to wind up owning my own business. And I go, why are you here? It's like, I thought it'd be rude not to come. And the professor did go through all the effort. And they said, well, we appreciate your honesty, but really we're looking for someone who wants to do finance. I was like, well, thank you for the opportunity. But I didn't wind up taking, obviously.
Yeah. What other like extracurriculars or clubs were you involved in college?
So in terms of being on campus, I did not participate a lot besides anything involved with business aspects. I had an interest in high school. I played on tennis. So in terms of actual collegiate extracurriculars, probably not a lot. I did start an interest in terms of looking at opportunities for business, even in that area, just because that's where my parents' businesses were. So
yeah. So after college, what was
I was working 40 hours. I was working nearly 40 hours a week and taking a full load, so I didn't have a lot of time to.
That's true. After college, did you end up taking over your father's printing business, or did you like have other business endeavors before that?
So the interesting thing about that was quote the game plan, but as we all know, plans do change.
That's true.
So because my father had this interest in technology for me, I was starting to look at things in a different way. Printing, you have to understand, back then, even until when I owned my business, was very analog. Okay, things were done in a very traditional method inside of a dark room and had, emulsion processes and burnings of plates. So it was very hands-on. I then started wanting to expand. I wanted to be a little more aggressive in expanding my parents' business, and they didn't see the need for that. So it was at that time I decided to go ahead and kind of move off. You have to understand when I started with them, when it's called typesetting. So back then, what we would physically do to produce a business card, just to give you an idea of how tactile this was, there would be a sheet of letters of the alphabet, sticky letters, and you would take and you would burnish in one letter at a time to form a word. Okay. And then you'd have to shoot a negative and then produce a plate to even print it. Later on, I talked to them, we got what we call the typesetting machine, but just like HTML, you'd have to code things to say, I want it to be this font, this letter, and it was all coding to produce it. And then later, of course, then you have desktop publishing, which everyone seems to be doing now. So,
Interesting. So then, like, I guess, like, since the plan didn't end up going the way like the game plan wanted to work, what happened after that, or like what were the jobs that you had after that?
Well, afterwards, so at that time, I was married at 25. So I had taken off a couple of years of college. So my college career, I graduated. We were looking forward. My wife is a physician. She was in her internship first, and she went into residency. In her residency program, she was over with the Baylor College of Medicine there. So we took a look at things and we decided to take a risk. So what little savings we did have, being newly married, we decided to invest into my own business, which was the Alpha and Omega Graphics, which we went to it was like kind of on the cutting edge of doing desktop publishing direct to negative. So instead of doing all the typesetting and all that, we would do negative, which then we compare to the plates. So that was kind of the first, should I say, it's kind of the first cornerstone or first stepping stone into what is now the modern day of printing. And from there, we just continued to grow that. But yeah, it was a big step for us. It was really difficult.
Yeah, at such a young age too.
At a pretty young age, because the equipment, I mean, even equipment investment back then was probably close to $60,000. And in today's age, if you were to take the inflation rate, you're talking pretty good six figures into something like that. So
when did you or did you ever move back to like your father's printing business or your family one?
I continued to help where I could. I mean, we went on to do other things. My parents certainly used me as a vendor just because it was a process they wanted to continue to do. I had a crew, we had a crew that continued to work with them that I had trained up who were very competent in being able to do the work. So we were comfortable. But, as in everything, moving from analog to digital grew pretty exponentially. And so eventually my parents, their business kind of aged out. They aged out.
Yeah.
They went on to do different things. After my parents closed and sold off the assets, this is when my mom actually used her public health degree. She wound up working for the city of Houston.
Okay.
In infectious disease. In fact, her specialty, this is during the AIDS epidemic. She was one of the top people in her study of AIDS over there and keeping up and tracking, going to the hospitals, and then onto other infectious diseases as well. So, and then my father, I kind of laugh about this. My father went on, they had a smaller stationery store. He went back to that, but then he wound up owning a laundromat, which we all just kind of laughed about because it was it's one of those stereotypical businesses.
Yeah.
So, but he had a couple of scares in running the business, and we at that point said we're going to shut it down. So
at what age did you kind of transition from like business entrepreneurship to doing more like education, volunteering, community, like public service stuff?
So it actually had to start when we had children. So I actually wound up, gosh, when did I wind up selling my business? I think it was 2004 is when I think I sold my business, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
Uh, what was before then? Let me think. Yeah, 2004, I think.
Mm.
Um, it had to do when we wound up having children.
Yeah.
Because when you own your own business, you do everything for that business, and so the focus was very much on the business and continuing to grow it. You reinvest it. In many ways, it is like a child, right? You have to feed it to grow it. Um, so you take your money and you reinvest and you continue, and it grows, and you nurture it and continue watching. Um, the story is I was supposed to take the kids to see Santa on
Hmm.
Christmas, and I wasn't able to do it. And my wife took the kids and they had their photo taken. It was called Santa in the Village, which happens over in the Rice Village area there.
Yeah.
Had
Yeah.
the photos taken.
Hmm.
And I came back and it was pretty late, and I had just gotten home right before my daughter was going down to sleep for the night. I
Hmm.
walked in, gave her a kiss, and I said, "Oh, how was it?" And she goes, "Oh, it was okay. Nothing great." And I said, "Okay." Shut the door, go down, throw the dinner into the microwave, and my wife is there, and she goes, the kids actually had a really good time, and she told you that for your benefit because she didn't want you to feel bad that you weren't able
Oh.
to make it.
Hmm.
And so after that, it kind of reset my priorities and time looking things. I think everything happens for a reason. I think a lot of things happen in God's timing. So at that time, our nanny, she had a big health scare and was not going to be able to stay with us. Um, and so we talked about priorities because my daughter is at that age where schooling starts happening and so forth. We had a young son at that point. My son is 2 years younger than my daughter.
Hmm.
Um, and so my my wife is a physician at this point, a radiologist, in a good partnership. We just made the decision. The easiest thing was for me to go ahead and sell the business.
Mm.
Um, so after selling the business and my kids are entering into school, um, I realized where we were at, our school, um, West University, is we're pretty lucky. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it just is. It's not the highest funding school. In fact, it's the lowest in HSD. But because of the demographics of the area, the PTO makes up for any shortfalls within the system.
Yeah.
But then I started to look around and see other schools within the areas, because we were also involved at, um, first it was Houston Chinese Church, and then we moved over to St. Luke's Methodist.
Hmm.
Um, and I worked in a program called Kids Meals, and then and that's providing meals for children that are prior to school age or young school age, because a lot of them have food insecurities. It wasn't until then I kind of went around and looked at other schools. We also did a backpack program, and then um, went to go look at the school over there by the Hope Mission downtown,
Yeah.
and just really kind of take a look at things. And that I realized at that point how blessed we were to be in our situation.
Hmm.
And so that was probably the first stepping stones. And then working in public education, even at the local level at a school that does have great parent support, you could see that public education has shortfalls and gaps within the system holistically, not even just locally, but holistically. There's some really big gaps. So
Would you say like moving from having your own business to like doing more like public education, public service, like volunteering and stuff was an easy transition, or was it kind of something you had to adjust to?
um, I I would say that any skill set that you learn in life provides you with a certain foundation in order to be able to do certain transitions. Certainly they're not the same animal. I'm not going to say that at all, because when you own your own business, the buck stops with you, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you take the praise, you also take any arrows that are slung at you as well. Okay, you make your own time. So, I'm a firm believer the time and effort you put in is what you reap at the end.
Mhm.
Um, Public education is not so much that. Even within the systems itself, at a local level and at a district level, there are so many layers that are involved in that, and you learn to work much more um, as a team. And even in PTOs and so forth in the organization. So the skill sets I took from business certainly helped in that.
Mhm.
Um, but realizing that you have to reacclimate yourself to certain things. Um, Certainly there's a level of, for lack of a better word, um, political um, clout that has to be expended when dealing in
Mhm.
such environments. Um, and so I would say it helps, but definitely you have to kind of reacclimate yourself into working in that.
You mentioned earlier that there's like some like gaps or like some clear like things that are difficult in working in public education. So like after your time serving as like in the PTOs of like elementary, middle, like high schools, what would you say is the biggest challenge of working in public education?
Well, if you're talking about locally within a school,
Mhm.
um, parents at an elementary school are very involved. They will
Mhm.
sign up for everything from back then, the birthday parties to teacher appreciation, um, any of those type things. As you get older, it's natural for, of course, children to want more independence and then
Mhm.
parents to matriculate out of the type of system.
Mhm.
My argument would be this, is that I think um, as children get older, they they still need a certain amount of guidance, because being totally hands off too soon,
Mhm.
okay, um, too soon can cause the fact that children will slip through the cracks. And I'm not necessarily always talking about your own children. I'm just talking
Yeah.
in general in the whole system. One thing we found out about public education is the most foundational years for public education is basically pre-K 4 to third grade. Third
Mhm.
grade is the watershed year for most children. Most gaps can be made up by that third grade year. If you are not reading on level by third grade, it becomes exponentially more difficult as you move up. For, for public education, your fourth grade grades is and is what is used in the rubrics to set you up for middle school.
Mhm.
If you are not set up by third grade and you enter fourth grade and with standardized testing and everything else, and realizing that your fourth grade grades is what is used in the matrix, you may not necessarily get into the magnet program that you want to.
Mhm.
That has a cascading effect as you move up from middle school to high school.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. On the flip side, what do you think is the biggest reward of doing like this type of job?
in public education, I think it's I had, when I was PTO president, um, our PTO, when I was setting up the theme with the leaders within the group, came out with the saying, "Our children are our greatest legacy."
Mhm.
Okay, you know, parents, adults, leaders, you leave a certain amount of legacy behind in the end, right? The one thing we wanted to do was we wanted to leave things better than how we found them, and I think that should be said in any leadership capacity. So when we're dealing in a system like this, where you're talking about nearly 220,000 kids in the HIC system alone, okay, and you realize that 80+% of those require free and reduced lunch, which means they're low SES, social economic status.
Mhm.
Um, you realize very quickly, one, either how blessed you are, or two, how much work still there is left to be done within the system. So even after 17 years, I don't have children in the system. I'm still doing things with HISD and still trying to move that needle at this point. And we use the analogy a lot of it's the Titanic, right?
Mhm.
We know that we know what the dangers are if we don't get our children educated. You look at where the U.S. sits in terms of international education, okay, compared to other places, and you
Mhm.
realize that we're behind and we're continuing to slip behind. And that has to do with the fact that I don't feel like we invest enough time, money, or effort into the public education system. Granted, it is the largest part of the sum of money in the Texas education system, but when you look at Texas as a whole compared to other states, our funding is far below. We're in the 40s,
Yeah.
you know. Um, so that's where you kind of go from local level, from PTOs, to doing work at the district level, and then going to speak and talk to people at the state legislation, the legislators, and asking them for more funding. And you go to speak to your local representatives, or you'll pick up and um, you know pick up the phone and call those that are on the education committee, the subcommittees. Um, I also wound up doing a fellowship with Leadership ISD a couple of years ago too, which also promotes a lot of the same values, kind of pushing forward, um,
Mhm.
you know, about inequities and funding inequities and asset, asset distributions, and just trying to fill gaps. Um, a lot of the volunteers that are in this, you only have 10 fingers, 10 toes, and there's a lot of holes in that dike, so.
I know you've been mentioning that you also serve on the as like a District 5 appointee, right, for the HISD. What exactly like does that role entail? Because I think you're currently serving as that still.
Correct. So District Advisory Committee is as it sounds. It is a group of teachers, administrators, and parents and community leaders. Um, it used to be years ago that it was the superintendent would sit in on that. They don't do that anymore. It's something that I actually wish that either a cabinet level member or the superintendent would sit back in. But it's about certain things that we bring before the Board of Education, the trustees, the 9 trustees and HISD. We make suggestions. We do not set policy. So in governance of education, it is the trustees that set up the goals for administrators. Um, it is up to the administrators to then manage those goals and fulfill the goals.
Mhm.
We as a district advisory committee, therefore, send forth recommendations and views upon certain policies that are coming forth in terms of education on how to improve and move that needle in order to create an equitable and yet high quality education for the students of HISD. So of course, the most important thing when we look at things is safety among
Yeah.
the kids. We talk about that. We talk about access to programs such as Magnet. Okay, but we also talk about teachers and the importance of teachers. It's a well-known fact. The number one influence in a child's education is a quality teacher inside the classroom. Number one, and then number two is the administrator who can support that teacher, local principal, administrators higher up within Hattie Mae. So we tried to find ways. Of course, there's some minutia things like continuing education, which has more to do with the teachers and the administrators. Parents a lot of times don't get the nuances of that, but that's what we're there to do: sit and learn and kind of discuss. So the advantage of me being in an environment like that is because I have been there for over 17 years within the system. I don't have children there. I don't have, I quote, don't have an agenda within the system besides trying to move the needle. I have sat on gosh, I think the last four named magnet committees. So I bring an institutional knowledge to HSD that a lot of people don't have in that sense. Um, I've gone through Dr. Saavedra, I've gone through Dr. Greer, Dr. Kranza, okay, Dr. Lathan, and now our fifth one, Dr. House. So
Hmm.
5 superintendents.
Wow, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
So after like all your experience, like serving in like these public education settings, what do you hope to see in the future for like Houston school districts, or like what's something that you want to see improve?
Well, my biggest thing is, and I mentioned this earlier, is I would like to see the pre-K program, which has just started recently, um, to be more robust and see if we can home grow that foundation or that cornerstone in education by third grade. Now, HIC is an extremely diverse population. We have students that are coming over who don't speak any English from many different foreign countries. I can't even remember how many languages that there are out there within HSC. I know it's well over 20, maybe greater than 30 different languages that are brought in here. And certainly those students are not the one, those students are brought into the system and then are brought up very quickly through it. But really are, in order to grow and set that cornerstone, I think that an incredible amount of attention should be paid to pre-K forward to third grade to get literacy up. The problem right now is with standardized education, especially with in testing. We talk about the testing culture. Everyone's like, well, why do we do this? Well, a lot of it has to do with funding from the federal level, right? There's an accountability that has to be addressed when we talk about that, because the money has to come from somewhere, right? And the federal dollars don't make up the largest portion, state dollars do. The state also has an accountability system too, as well, within TEA. So in order to do this, I think we need to look at that, because the problem, like what I was getting to about testing, is most of it's reading. You look at the math, it's word problems, right? You look at the ACTs, reading the history part, the science part. It's all about reading comprehension.
Yeah.
If you don't understand the question, there is no way you're going to get it correct moving forward. And this as a university student, when it comes to critical thinking, if you don't get that first part of it down, anything you come afterwards is basically going to be erroneous. So
yeah, kind of like transitioning over again to your like public service career, how did you become a city council member?
So a lot of what I wound up doing in public education, in that sense, I think did help me kind of moving forward. I mean, I've lived in this neighborhood for 17 years. I had always continued to do things within the neighborhood. So prior to being on city council, I worked a lot with the parks, Park, which is what you see in the background right now. That was after we did the renovations. As blessed as we were to live within this neighborhood, there were still some things that needed to be addressed. So going way back, I was actually involved with our swim team here at Southside, the All-Stars, and I volunteered for 10 years. I was involved either as swim director or co-swim director for 4 plus years. And so that's all there within the park. And then later I became the park board president. And when I went into that job, I didn't realize Southside at that time, the park was actually privately owned. It did not belong to the city. So it was very interesting the way that Southside had originally set it up, was that the neighbors were all a shareholder within this corporation, which owned the park and the assets within the park, which meant the tennis court, the pool, at one time the clubhouse, but then the clubhouse was redone, refinanced, and then that asset was then sold off to the city. They didn't sell it in that traditional sense. It was more a conveyance of assets, right? when I looked at it, this is where I brought in my business experience. I broke open the books and I took a look at it, and I looked at, I looked at basically the inputs of the fees coming in versus the output of money that we're going to do.
Mhm.
And then I knew something about playgrounds because of my public education. And
Yeah.
so I started walking around doing inspection, and I said, this is not CPSC compliant. This is not ADA compliant. This is 17 years old. Yeah, it needs to be redone. So that's, and then knowing that this was a private, I looked at it and I told all the board members plus all the membership, the general membership, I was like, my job here in my 1 year is to work myself out of a job.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is we can no longer exist as a functioning organization. I will get this to city council, and I want to convey the assets of all the parklands over to the city. So in that process, there was a 501c3 that is which is the park fund. And it had not been utilized in a number of years. So I found volunteers within the neighborhood. I went around to neighbors and friends and said, hey, this is where we're at. This is what I'm trying to do. Will you help me achieve this? And so it had gone through revocation. I helped to get out of IRS revocation and got it reset back up again as a 501c3. And then we started fundraising. And the long story short is within, gosh, under a year, we raised $500,000, a little over $500,000. And then wound up renovating the park and getting it planned out. Lanston B. Jones was a landscape architect who set up the initial part, but because of my initial background at Texas A&M, when I was up there, I was in their architectural program. So I helped design and set forth a lot of what was going on at that time. And then because of that, because I knew we couldn't set up, I had to start working with city council and the mayor saying, hey, I know this is not your headache, but I'd like to get the park in such condition and then convey all the assets over to you if you will continue the upkeep and certain parameters. So what also isn't known is that all that land at the park is also completely protected. You can never build anything commercial or residential property. So it will always permanently remain a green space for the city. Because the land here in the South Side is worth a lot of money, per square foot. So, but that's how I got involved with city council. I mean, just prior to that, also during the same time as my involvement with Poor Farm Ditch, the flooding issues that were going on with the neighborhood for. So that's at a higher level with the Harris County Flood Control and all that. I would attend those meetings within council, but my deep involvement became with the Parks Association. And then after that was all conveyed and everything was done, and seeing the work that council did, because I would have to attend meetings within council and I would just sit afterwards, I realized I wanted to do something at a higher level.
What do you think about like the fact that stereotypically like Asians don't really serve in this like industry occupation? I feel like obviously like recently there's been some more candidates, but there's kind of the expectation that like Asians are like going to like medical or like law or engineering fields, not really into like public service. What do you think about that?
We kind of laugh about that in my family, on the Chan side of our family. My mother's a Pang, but my father wanted to go into graphic arts, which is like so different because one of his brother was an aircraft engineer. The other one was went into medicine, not a physician, but was doing what is it called, electron microscope. So he's heads up a department there in California. So very typical. Most people are engineers or medicine. But my father decided he wanted to be an artist. So that was a bit of a shock to my grandparents. But he was successful in what he did in graphic arts. A lot of his campaigns are still known within Shell Oil Company and are used. So in that sense, I didn't have that typical thing, in terms of models. Of course, my parents wanted me to do something successful, but I wound up having an entrepreneurial spirit in that sense. And then I am different in the sense in my family that I wanted to be involved in leadership, even younger in high school. Um, like I wanted to be involved in our youth groups leadership. Like I wanted to plan to be part of those meetings and whenever we did camps and so forth and
Yeah.
service projects and like that. So
How did your parents or like rest of your family react when you decided to run for public office?
um, they asked me if I really wanted to do it, but they were proud of the fact that I continue to serve. Uh, we left Houston Chinese Church to go to St. Luke's because it's closer to us, but two, we had some opportunities to serve over there. So my parents have always known that I've always wanted to serve in some capacity, no matter where I go.
Mm-hmm.
So they just wanted to make sure that if I was doing it for the right reasons,
Mm-hmm.
And my thing when I spoke the campaign trail was that I really do. I'm a servant leader, right? I'm a servant's heart. I want to be able to do things, and as I said before, I want to leave things better than I found them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, they were proud of the fact that I wanted to do that. I mean, I continue to work with other 501c3s. I mean, my sister, we lost my niece at a very young age. She was 7 years old to a very rare form of brain cancer, DIPG. Don't ask me to pronounce it because I'll slaughter, but it's DIPG, which is a brain cancer. And then took a while, but we wound up setting up a branch for researchers called The Cure Starts Now, and I still sit on her board on that. And that organization is trying to find literally the home run cure for cancer and pediatric cancer.
Mm-hmm.
They've done miraculous things, but I've done the MS 150 8 times, right from Houston to Austin. And now they're changing the route from here to A&M. But, I challenge myself in those sense, but I would like to always think that I'm challenging myself with purpose. So,
How did you end up becoming the mayor pro tem in 2016?
So I had just started council. The previous mayor pro tem was Randy Sim. And he had finished his term and he was stepping off of council, so left a vacancy. Mayor Patterson at that time was looking for it. And as I said, I wanted to kind of get involved at a higher level. So I approached him. There's another council person who also was interested in it. I think he just found confidence in me and decided to allow me to be mayor pro tem, and so I took over the roles as such.
And that was during Hurricane Harvey too, right?
Prior to Hurricane Harvey's when I took over, the mayor had set up a vacation. He had already left, and Hurricane Harvey comes roaring into our backyards. And,
oh my gosh, yeah. What was it like being mayor then?
A little nerve-wracking, to be quite honest with you. We knew it was going to be bad. We didn't know how bad it was going to be. When they started talking about rainfall that was as great or not greater than Allison, that's a little nerve-wracking because homes did flood here during Allison. Now, the rainfall pattern and sheet flow patterns were very different this time with Harvey. We did not get the deluge directly dropped upon us as the northern part of this greater metropolitan area. So we kind of escaped that. If those same rain patterns that hit here in the southern part, it'd be a much different story.
Yeah.
Now, I give all the credit to our first responders. The police were out there and the fire department. They slept through and they slept at City Hall. And,
Mm.
I'm very thankful for the efforts they put in. We assisted in many high water rescues that were not in part of the city of Southside. Um, we didn't have homes damaged like our neighboring city of West University place.
Mhm.
They had many homes that
Yeah.
were damaged.
So kind of transitioning over to like this most recent election, congratulations by the way on
Oh,
being
thank you.
the mayor of Southside Place. What motivated you to like run for mayor of your city?
Mayor Patterson, who said he was retiring after 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
let it be known. Um, uh, I thought to myself, I wanted to still continue the work that I started as in council.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Many of the things I wanted to do had to do with continuing to push the agenda of flood mitigation.
Yeah.
City of Southside is what we call on a 1 year standard, which means once a year there's something that's going to cause street flooding within our city.
Mm-hmm.
1 year flood event. So most municipalities are on a 2 year standard. Poor Farm Ditch is a 66-year-old ditch. It's been on the replacement list with Harris County Flood Control for 21 years. It still has not been done. Um, we've had multiple failures of actual collapsing of the cement part of the ditch into the channel.
Mm-hmm.
So that potential of that particular controlled area for water being able to move through and to get to Brays Bayou, if that's compromised, it will flood Southside and West U in a pretty catastrophic way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Um, because of my familiarity with that, I wanted to make sure that I kind of continue that. I also wanted to continue to make sure that Southside was a safe and great place to raise families. I mean, we have as many as 3 generations now living here in this Southside place. And you can't say that about many places, that grandparents, you know, great grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
kids alike all want to be within literally walking distance of each other. I mean, I very kiddingly say, but in all seriousness, this is what Mayberry would be like in modern day times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that was a large part of it.
Mm. How have the last like 2 months been since the May 1st election?
Um, being on council, you get information packets and so forth, and you get a lot of that information prior to city council meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I like to be in the know, so I'm trying to always acquire knowledge and information. When I don't know something, I'm not afraid to pick up the phone and ask questions. So I'm sure our city manager, David Moss, who is incredible and has been with us for 20 something years, probably one of the most gabby mayors he's ever had to deal with in that sense. But I think it's important. So I pick up the phone, I call him, talk to the mayor of City of West University Place. We've already had a lunch meeting just to build a more synergy in a cooperative environment. We have interlocal agreements between City of West U, City of Bel Air, City of Houston in terms of coverages, and I'm trying to build upon that. I've already had a meeting with the Harris County Commissioner, District 3, Tom Ramsey, to talk about this. Um, you know, met with Alan Black multiple times prior to me being there, and then after Commissioner Ramsey's office, who just recently actually got named the interim head of director of Harris County Flood Control.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, the current one had resigned. So,
I saw that like you gained I think 87% of the electorate in the election. What do you think? Like, I mean, that's a pretty significant number. Aside from your like years serving in the city or like living here, what do you think was the key for you to win the support of like Southside Place citizens?
Um, I actually canvassed and went pretty much door to door twice. We'll go up. There's the old saying of, you want to put a face in front of people.
Mhm.
Um, Southside is not a very large municipality. Uh, so I think it's important for people to know that there's someone who's willing to meet with them
Mhm.
and listen to them. Uh, a lot of people knew me by name of reputation and have seen my name involved in different things, but never knew me as, as the person. So um, I went around and made sure that I try to talk to people, address them. It was challenging during COVID,
Mhm.
because you want to maintain safe distance. Walking with a mask and being in hot weather was not real fun, but I found it to be necessary. But I think it spoke to the fact that people were confident in me as the candidate to
Mhm.
be able to continue on and to be able to work on those things in which um, which I had spoke about. And we had a candidate forum um, where the candidates for the different open positions were and I spoke then, and I just reinforced it when I went walking around. So, and, I appreciate the voters. I was also told something like that number of voters might have been greater than even the presidential election. So voters came out to speak their mind. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Cool. How do you think you'll plan on continuing to involve residents in like decision-making processes like in your town?
Council meetings are open to everybody, but one thing I've already talked to council members and to the city manager is that I'm probably going to hold a lot more town hall meetings than any other mayor has. I think it's important. I like to do at least twice, maybe even 3 times a year, where I'm actually going to reach out to the different civic organizations and different committees. I'll probably, and then to get them to come to speak to council on a more regular basis.
Mhm.
Um, and then try to get people involved. I think it's important that people understand what is going on within their community.
Yeah.
Certainly, we're trying to address other things and developing a better form of communication. One of the first things I did on council when I came in was I told them we need to update the website. Our website was antiquated.
Mhm.
You weren't getting information. You didn't get emergency alerts. It literally was a straight, oh, this is the city of Southside.
Mhm.
And then maybe you had the police number and so forth. Now it's been modernized where it'll send out alerts. It's much more intuitive. You can make reservations. You can pay bills. If there's warning of floods, it gets kicked out to people's cell phones, and the emails get sent out. So communication is a big thing. The other thing when I was working on the Parks Board was I had created a newsletter. Unfortunately, after I left, um, the newsletter didn't get published. So I'd like to be able to do that again,
Mhm.
in terms of city communication.
What would you say is the best way to handle like criticism from residents in your city?
I think anytime you hear criticisms, it's something that bothers them. Um, but one thing I've also learned too is that there are some things you can't do things about, and to understand that in the position that we are,
Mhm.
okay, in terms of council or the mayor, we're about governance. Okay, we set policies. The city manager has to enact those policies that we set forth. Okay.
Mhm.
At the same time, you can also legislate yourself with so many layers that you've become the very thing that you're not supposed to be, and that is you are bureaucracy. You stand in the way of things. I'd love for everyone to be happy. I mean, that's just human nature, right? But there are some things like you can't do anything about, like,
Mhm.
you know, um, and you just do the best. Like you wish you could save every tree within the city, but if the tree is diseased, right,
Yeah.
there's a safety issue there. The tree has to be removed, and we'll replace it with something else. But there's an understanding that um, some things have to be seen through a different perspective, and So we listen to them, and if it's something that we can help that makes sense in terms of how the city as a whole can address it, we'll look into it.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What'd you say you love the most about the city of Southside Place?
The people,
Mm.
straight up, you know, um, this area really does appreciate the the whole small town neighborhood feel, right? Like I referred to it earlier as the modern day Mayberry.
Mhm.
It's, the blessing is that everyone's friendly and really does care about the neighborhood.
Mm.
Sometimes people know a little more than they should, but it's just kind of the way small, it's a small city, a small municipality, and being surrounded by a much larger municipality in the city of Houston. I mean, our neighborhood here, there's three small municipalities all within a 5 mile radius of each other, right? We have the city of West U, we have the city of Southside, and we have the city of Bel Air.
Yeah.
And then you look at the greater metropolitan of the city of Houston surrounding all of us. But we've all kept our own independent, unique identity. So,
Yeah, that's something that's definitely unique to Houston.
yes.
Mhm. What is your vision for Southside Place future in like 10 to 20 years?
That's a good question. The one thing I said I would like to do is when I was campaigning is I want to continue the legacy of Southside Place. And what I mean by that is I want this still to fill and have its own unique footprint within the larger city. I want us to continue being neighborly. And as I said before, I want it to be a very safe and loving environment by which we can raise families. I think that's important. Um, moving forward, it's the one thing I have seen over the years is because with the advent of technology, for better or for worse, is that there is the time that we spend together as neighbors is not as great as it was, and time is time is not a commodity in that sense, right? It's an asset. It's only finite, and so I'm seeing less and less of neighbors coming out. Um, and the funny thing is you saw more neighbors being neighborly during times of need, like during Hurricane Harvey or during the freeze, right? When when uh, the modern comforts are taken away in that sense. What I would like to see is that we don't forget that part of our humanity about making those type of connections. So, I'm trying to find more community events. Swim team is near and dear to my heart because of my involvement all these years, but it was a way that families who don't see each other normally during the year get together, because a lot of the kids here go to private schools and different schools, and some kids go to public school. But it's the one thing that draws all the families together into one unified team to be able to do things. So it gets kids to be able to reconnect and those connections. We have a summer camp here, which is, gosh, been running forever, where kids just come in and they just hang and just,
Yeah.
they have a good time being able to do that, without necessarily the distractions of, all the modern devices. So.
Yeah. What would you say is like your greatest accomplishment to date for the city?
Overall, greatest singular, probably what you're seeing behind me is the renovation of Fire Truck Park Fund, the Fire Truck Park. It's it was a great team effort by all those that were involved, and we had multiple members, and we had the whole community come together. We raised a lot of money within the neighborhood, but we had people reaching out to the different businesses in the area. And to be able to raise that much money in that short of a time and be able to do that much with it, I was, without exaggeration, I was spending 30 hours a week up there doing a lot of supervising and going through and making sure we got things right. We went to the extent of even that new trees that we were planting. had enough root growth pattern for their canopies to make sure it wasn't going to compete with other ones. And we knew other trees that were in decline would eventually have to be taken out. And we accounted for that. So we really did try to look at everything very holistically as we were doing this. From planning of certain zones were set up to be just toddlers, so if you were watching and everything, we made sure you could pivot within the shaded pavilion so you could have an eye. So littler kids were always right up against the pavilion area, and then the older kids' items were further away and so forth. So, it was a great team effort. But I really enjoyed that. And the next thing we did on council was the swimming pool, redoing the swimming pool. The pool then was only 4 feet deep, so it wasn't in diving regulations. There were a lot of safety issues that needed to be addressed for such an old pool, and we were blessed enough to get the money through council, and we ran that through the city. So, realizing that when I was park board president, I knew we would never get enough money to be able to do that. So, when the city was kind enough to take over all the assets, they knew what was coming down the pipeline, and it took a few years, but they saw fit to kind of move that through, and now we got a very nice permanent green space.
It's really cool. So I'm sure you know, but like you're the first like Chinese American and Asian in Texas to be mayor of Southside Place. What does that like historical kind of title or accomplishment mean to you?
It was interesting that I didn't think about that at all when I was running, in a sense. But considering the year that we're coming off of, and actually, 4 years prior to that, and how things have transpired, I do take pride in that. There's even some talk about, and this can't be confirmed nor denied, but I think I was told that I'm the first American-born Chinese mayor in the history of Texas. But records are so loose because there's so many small municipalities.
Yeah.
But when I think a Chinese newspaper actually approached me about that and told me that, I was a little bit shocked to hear that. There have been several other Asian mayors, but they've all been born in their native countries and become mayors while here. So yeah, and I took pride in knowing that, considering what we're coming off of. Yeah.
What is the Asian population like in Southside Place?
It's actually a little higher than normal demographics. I think it's 14%.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, like how do you think that your role as mayor, especially being like an ABC, like American born Chinese, is especially important during this time of like the pandemic and like this past couple years of like AAPI hate as well?
I think the main importance has to do with the fact that this particular community looks beyond ethnicity or even skin color. We have not experienced a lot within the little bubble of the city of Southside. Certainly, when I travel, I have a little more concern about it. We have a house in Wyoming that is right at the edge of the Grand Tetons. So when we're traveling, I'm certainly a little more aware of it. I have had situations where certainly someone has said something, and at that point, as long as it's not a safety to myself or my family, I let it go as certainly a bigoted type of statement. And kind of move on from there.
So outside of work and like serving in public service, like what are some things that you like to do in your free time? I know you mentioned like riding the MS-50 or 150 and then like church and stuff like that.
So yes, cycling was a much larger part of my life when I had more time. And certainly I've already told my wife, I said, I'm on the I'm in the mid side of 50s. I've ridden 8. It'd be nice to get to double digits, because double digits riding the MS 150 it's not a large percentage of people who wind up doing it. So certainly want to try to get a couple more in.
Yeah.
You know, I laugh when I owned my own business. I probably had more leisure time in doing things because I'm entertaining clients than I do in my public service. But I certainly love to fish. I used to play some golf, and I used to play a lot of tennis, but I don't play as much as I used to. Certainly like to read. Um, you know, I actually even still play video games with the kids who are college students. So, you know, I still do that. And I play D&D with them every now and then. So,
How old are your kids now?
so my eldest daughter is Cameron. She is 22. She only has a few more hours. She's at Texas A&M College Station, so she's about to finish out. And then she's looking at postgraduate work right now in psychology. Her eventuality is that she probably wants to go into med school. My wife's a little discouraging on that just because medicine is not the same as it used to be, but she really has a heart for service in the sense of mental health. So she wants to be a psychiatrist and work with adolescents, do that. My son is 20. He's at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. He is currently studying. He's currently studying meteorology. It's interesting because after Hurricane Ike, that really affected him. He wanted to do research in that. Yeah. Now, as he's into it, he's actually been changing into environmental science. So he's very big into that type. So each of them have their own way of doing service in that sense. You know, I told them it doesn't have to be like me, but I always want them to remember when you're in a position to give back, you certainly should.
Yeah, definitely a service.
Yeah.
How do you think the pandemic has like affected relationships and like community bonding, especially within your city?
You know, we have an aging group of citizens in here, and I think it was difficult for them that their family couldn't come visit them. Certainly internally in the beginning, because we also have on the flip side very young family. I think for a lot of parents the difficulty was the virtual school.
Yeah.
For them, that's, you know, for a short time it was okay, but we very quickly found out, even in the latest STAR scores, you could see what a difference in school teaching does. It also makes parents appreciate a whole lot more what teachers do, because it's certainly not easy to teach your own child. And then some of the material, of course, is not material that we've seen in 20 to 30 years. You know, I couldn't do a Diffie-Q equation right now to save my life, right? So, you know, so, you know, my wife, who's a physician, actually had to think long and hard about some of the biology and, you know, chem questions my daughter was asking her.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's hard, even for a university student who wanted to be there, because you can't take, when you do an anatomy class, you can't touch, you know, you can't work on anything because you don't see it. So, you know, those classes have to, of course, be pushed off for the and those kids, a lot of kids in college wound up going back home here in the city. You had rising seniors and senior graduates that didn't get to experience a normal end of their high school career before they moved on. You know, you had kindergartens who definitely are much more tactile in their learning and have to be taught that social environment, who were isolated. So, you know, there were certainly challenges by all facets of our neighborhood. So now that we're kind of coming out on it, we're seeing more and more activity. Certainly at the parks, we had to shut down the parks as policy, shut down the playgrounds. We shut down our clubhouse, our pool, you know, as per all the safety protocols that were being set for. So it affected us financially too, as well, because a lot of the money comes from ad valorem taxes and sales taxes from the business area. When the business is shut down, they can't sell anything. We don't reap any of the revenue from that either. And, you know, uh, uh, so yeah, it did. It affected our city.
Mhm. So kind of going to like the last set of questions about your just own personal identity. How would you say you identify yourself? Would you say like you're Chinese, Chinese American, American, or like Houstonian?
So it's interesting. And so when I talk about it, I put nationality first.
Mhm.
So I'm an American. Okay. Um, but my ethnicity is Chinese. So I am American born Chinese.
Yeah.
Now, some people would say, well, you're actually Chinese born American. Well, in the sense that uh, the oath we swore into office is that we're also here to, we're swearing an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, right? I don't look at ethnicity being an aspect of that. So
Mm.
whether I was Caucasian or whether I was African American, when you're sworn into public office in that sense, we're here to defend the Constitution, right?
Mhm.
And uphold the laws of the state and the federal government as well. So in that sense, I identify as American first.
I see.
Okay. Um, Now, going back to the fact that I'm Chinese, I'm proud of our heritage. I mean, my parents have done a lot of things. Certainly in history, the Chinese have done amazing things, you know.
Mhm.
And my parents to this day still practice a lot of some things they brought over. Um, we adhere to them in association with my parents. My kids, on the other hand, know of them but don't appreciate it. Like, it's also interesting that a lot of people don't remember, like, the Chinese Exclusion Act. You know,
Mhm.
that's not really taught very often within
Yeah.
the folks here in the state of Texas. And um, so when PBS had a special on it, we made the kids sit down. We talked about it with them. My wife's side of the family experienced a lot of that. She was born in New York originally, but then her family moved down to Mississippi. And there you see, of course, a lot more,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know. So, yeah, but
Mhm. What are your hopes for like Asian American communities, like in Southside Place and in just the U.S. in general?
in Southside Place, most of the people here are either physicians or engineers or, administrators. So, you know, when you look at the demographics, they're quite well to do. I
Yeah.
mean, it's, if you're living here at Southside, you're usually a professional or someone of a certain economic status. Okay. Um, in terms of their heritage, I think a lot of that's personal, right? We don't see a lot of that being outwardly demonstrated within the city of Southside. Certainly people talk about it within their social medias or within their inner circles, but we don't have any specific events within the city of Southside to do that. We recognize all the federal holidays, and certainly we adhere to anything that comes down from Austin in regards to whatever protocols, like during COVID, for instance.
Mhm.
Um, what I would like to do is see more people serve. Now, the one thing I will say is that if you look at it, even for the lower, the percentage is higher overall in terms of demographics, right? Here for Asians, but we've had two back-to-back mayor pro tems that were both Asian, right? Um, we do have people who step up in the different other um, committees that are here. So I'm glad to see that people will continue to participate. I think most people participate here um, simply because they want to continue to do something for the betterment of the community, right? Now, in terms of the United States, I would like people to take an opportunity to to step out of the comfort zone. Serving is not something that necessarily comes real natural, right? Because you kind of put yourself out there. And
Yeah.
the job that we do, whether it's in public education or what I'm doing now, it's not a paid position. People are always like, well, how's your office and how much are you getting paid? There's a ceremonial $1. No one has ever taken the $1, but it's more of a stands on ceremony. And certainly in public education, when you do service, like the brave people who serve as trustees for the Board of Education for HSD, they serve for 4 years. They put in 30 hours a week. They don't get paid anything either. So, you really need to do it with the right mindset and actually be pretty pure in your intentions. I mean, it gets exposed pretty quickly if you're doing this for any other reason, you know. Um, so I really do believe that if you're going to give, you give it your all while serving.
So, like, last question from my end, what would you say is kind of the biggest life lessons you learned, whether it be about like your career, your identity, or like public service or things like that?
I would say one of the things that most people need to learn, whether it's in service or business or in life, is about grace, whether it's to others and to yourself, um, I think a lot of times we're our own worst critics, no matter what we do. I think it's really important, though, to realize that, when you extend that grace out, you get that grace back in return. And so when you deal with the public in service, you've got to realize you also have to take time to listen. I think listening is a skill as a leader. A lot of times we don't do. A lot of leaders are in basically the I want to fix it mentality, as opposed to listening first and then taking in all that information and then making whatever policy or decision making based upon what you've heard. When you talked to me about criticism earlier, I take that in as information, not necessarily always as, it might seem like an attack to other people, but people, when they come with that, have concerns. It may not sound like a big deal to you by your perspective, but if they're complaining to you, there's a reason for it. And a lot of times you can take that information and integrate into whatever policy decision making you're doing as a leader. So, listening again is one of those skills. I think it's really important.
Of course, yeah. So that's all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the interview that I didn't get to touch on?
No, the only thing I would say again, and we did talk a little bit about this, was, I hope if other people do get to listen to this, is that I think it is important to, regardless, to find a way always to give back to your community. And I'm hoping Asians do find a voice in service. A lot of times we are portrayed in the sense that we're meek, we're quiet, we sit in the background, we're not policymakers, we're not, we're not necessarily the ones in front and center. And I'm more inclined to say that you don't have to necessarily have a lot of bravado in your service. Okay, I think actions speak a lot times greater than the words do. But to find a way to serve and give back to your community, I think when people see that, I think people realize that great things can be done. I mean, 87%, that's a pretty good number.
It is.
So
you want to talk about like your recipe a little bit too?
Sure. So our family really likes char siu baos. So I'm going to be sending in the recipe, actually how to make the char siu, and also actually make the bao part and the integration of that. And so it's something that we've been working on, and I've kind of got it down at this point. But in our family, we kind of kid around that there's a local bakery here called King's Bakery who only makes char siu baos and stuff. And I said, geez, I guess if this doesn't work out, I could always open up a bakery. So yeah, I'll be sending them a char siu bao recipe.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so if there's nothing else that you'd like to add, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.
Okay.